Musician Moby has called on the COP26 climate change conference here in Glasgow to make the climate-damaging impacts of animal agriculture central to the agenda if world leaders hope to make meaningful pledges to avert catastrophic climate breakdown. And Moby, who's not just a musician but also an animal rights activist and also supporter of the Humane Society International, joins me now from Los Angeles. I'm delighted to say, great to see you. Moby, we all know, don't we, that animal agriculture damages the climate, but you feel that that message isn't getting heard enough here in Glasgow. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, remember at COP21, there wasn't a single panel or mention of the consequences of meat and dairy production. And I was hoping that things would change for COP26, because obviously public awareness has evolved. But once again, you look at the legislative agenda at COP26, and there's no mention of, almost no mention of animal agriculture and methane production and rainforest deforestation and the other incredibly deleterious consequences of using meat and dairy for food.
So what would you like them to be hearing then? What would the message be?
The message would be one of honesty. You know, it reminds me of a conversation I had with Al Gore a few years ago. And I'm paraphrasing what Vice President Gore said, but he basically said, the role of meat and dairy production in climate change is the true inconvenient truth. You know, it's the truth that politicians don't want to talk about, that corporations don't want to talk about. It's the truth that so many people don't want to address for so many different reasons. And my hope is simply that there will be a change and people will be willing to look at the causes of climate change.
It's International Vegan Day, I think, today. One inconvenient truth is that you're never going to tell people that they can't eat meat. You can't ban meat altogether, can you?
Well, I don't know. It's certainly, I mean, if that were to ever
Is that what you'd like to
case,
see? Would you like to see meat banned?
What I would like to see, first and foremost, is for meat to cost what it actually costs, you know, to factor in the direct costs, because here in the United States, and I assume in the UK as well, and in Europe, we subsidize meat and dairy production so much that if it weren't for these subsidies, a family of four going to Burger King would spend about $100 on a meal. So I'm just saying, remove the subsidies. Stop subsidizing an industry that is destroying human health and is destroying the climate on the only home that we have.
You say that the issue isn't being heard at all, really, here in Glasgow. But Boris Johnson recently has said that he sees lab-grown, eco-friendly alternatives to meat as being the future. I mean, you must welcome that.
I welcome anything that puts us on a path that will enable us to, and I know this might sound like hyperbole, and I apologize because it's not hyperbole. I applaud anything that will enable us to avert catastrophe. And at present, I feel like so many of us have our heads in the sand. Like, you can't fix a problem if you're simply unwilling to look at the empirically supported reasons why the problem exists. And so if it's lab-grown meat, if it's ending subsidies for meat and dairy production, whatever it takes to sort of prevent this unfolding catastrophe.
But of course, it's not just meat eating, is it, that causes huge issues with the climate? I was reading today about asparagus. One study has shown that for every 1 kilogram of asparagus eaten in the United Kingdom, 5.3 kilograms of carbon dioxide is produced. Now, that's no good either, is it?
I mean, all agriculture has consequences. There's no such thing. I mean, you could go even further and be philosophical and say all actions have consequences. Of course, all agriculture requires water and more often than not has CO2 emissions. But compared to meat and dairy, I mean, even the United Nations admits that meat and dairy production is the third leading cause of climate change. So I don't think asparagus ranks as one of the global leading causes for climate change. And keep in mind, I'm a vegan and I don't really like asparagus that much. So I'm not going to stick up for asparagus.
Yeah, that was just an example. I mean, there are plenty more examples, aren't there, of and fertilizer and the way we farm crops and all the rest of it. How much of your campaign is actually about the climate and the effects that meat eating has on the climate, and how much is actually about the ethics of meat eating? Because we know you're a huge animal lover, you do a huge amount of work for animal welfare. Is it more about that than actually about the climate?
Well, in this instance, especially with COP26 happening now, my focus is on the climate. I mean, personally, I'm a vegan and an animal rights activist because I just can't, in good conscience, be involved in anything that causes animal suffering or contributes to animal suffering. But right now, the focus has to be on the climate. And I apologize for stating the obvious, but every issue that we care about depends upon a stable climate. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of people still think that they can have opinions about climate change. We can have opinions about jazz. We can have opinions about the Timothée Chalamet version of Dune. We can't have opinions about climate change because climate change is just an incontrovertible fact.
OK, can we have an opinion about this then? Boris Johnson again today in his speech mentioned scientists in New Zealand who are working out ways of injecting cows so that they produce less methane. Now, isn't that a sensible way to go? So meat eaters can still eat meat, but the reduction in methane means that we're helping the planet.
I mean, not to be dismissive, but it does remind me a little bit of that old Monty Python skit where they dig a trench in the beach for actors to walk in, and then they make the actors walk on boxes. Seems like there might be a simpler way to address the solution. When you're injecting cows to have them produce less methane, there might simply be a more direct way of getting cows to produce less methane, perhaps by having fewer cows. Because the other thing that doesn't take into account is sort of like the ancillary carbon footprint of animal agriculture, which is rainforest deforestation, water production, moving livestock to and from slaughterhouses, et cetera. Like, there's such a huge knock-on effect. So I don't mean to make light of it, but it does seem like there might be a more logical, effective way of addressing the consequences of animal agriculture.
OK, it's been a pleasure speaking to you and getting your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed, Moby. Much appreciated.
Oh, thank you for having me.